And welcome back. Citizens Housing and Planning is a not-for-profit research and education organization focused on housing policy and planning in New York City. Their mission has been to develop and advance practical public policies to support the housing stock of the city by better understanding New York's most pressing housing and neighborhood needs. The organization's research and education work has actually helped shape public policy, improving the city's housing stock and quality of life in New York City neighborhoods. They're committed to advancing the equity through housing and planning, and New York City's next housing plan must address the diverse needs of its 3.2 foreign-born residents to ensure an equitable recovery from COVID and a thriving future for New York City. Here to share now, providing more on the point of view on this matter, we're pleased to be joined by the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, Jessica Katz. And Jessica, good to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Daren.
Thank you. Well, listen, let's get right at it and talk a little bit about housing. I think the whole housing landscape, particularly after COVID-19, is going to see a significant shift. And a lot of people are struggling just to pretty much make ends meet. New York, as we know, very hardly hit economically, and the housing crisis is going to be at the forefront. Talk to us about what we're seeing and what you're seeing from your perspective.
Sure. So I think certainly after COVID, housing policy has seen an elevated place and an elevated kind of crisis, even worse than it was before in New York City. This is not the first crisis that New York City has weathered. We've been through a lot in the past, but each time we weather one of these crises, be it economic or 9/11 or a natural disaster or a global pandemic, the first thing we do in order to get ourselves out of that crisis economically is to invest deeply in affordable housing. And there's a risk right now that that's not the approach that this administration at the city level is going to take. So we really want to make sure that that investment in affordable housing helps to create the economic engine that can get us out of this economic downturn.
Yeah. And when we look at affordable housing from your perspective, how do you see it shaping up across the city landscape? I mean, you have some who argue and say, listen, we've done our fair share of affordable housing across the city. From your perspective, how do you see it?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, right? The affordable housing community really started as a social justice movement. The homes on Charlotte Street, and there was a lot of activism in the South Bronx that kind of created the CDC movement and created the affordable housing movement. So while we started as a movement, say 30, 40 years ago, now we've kind of turned into more of an industry. So I think it's incumbent on the affordable housing community now to get back to our social justice roots and really remind communities of the good work that we do and why we're doing it and for who.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about the housing plan for a city of immigrants report. Explain to our viewers a little bit about that and what that actually entails.
Sure. So every mayor comes into New York City with a big splashy housing plan. So if you haven't heard of this housing plan, you shouldn't be surprised. It tends to be a sort of industry facing document. And the metric to measure the success of each mayor's housing plan historically has been the number of units created or preserved. So the Mayor Bloomberg plan was 165,000 units. De Blasio upped the ante and said, I'm going to do 200,000 units, and then upped it to 300,000 units. So while I think that's a really powerful management tool that helps the staff inside HPD know if they're doing a good job or a bad job, and I worked at HPD for many years, so I just barely said we there. It's not a community engagement strategy, and it doesn't really share a lot about why we're doing the plan, where the housing is going to be, and who it's going to benefit. So it leaves a lot of activists and community members saying, affordable for whom? What is this plan really for? So what CHPC wanted to do for the next housing plan is to kind of take what's so powerful about the unit counting metric and really increase that and apply that to a larger social purpose. So we're creating a variety of new lenses, we call them, on what the next housing plan should look like. And our first report is a housing plan for an immigrant city. So if your goal of the housing plan wasn't just to create a certain number of units, but the goal was specifically to advance and honor our past, our present, and our future as a city of immigrants, what would that housing plan look like? Very different than the kind of housing plans that are just looking at numbers of units across neighborhoods.
And when we look at those numbers, look, 3.2 million immigrants believed to be in New York City. A lot of them right there and right there in urban neighborhoods. Talk to us about that and really recognizing that need, because when we talk about immigrants, sometimes they're not always discussed. For lack of a better saying, they're not always discussed on the front burner, but many times, many of the issues really are prevalent in society and they go unaddressed.
Absolutely. So 1 in 4 New Yorkers is born in a different country, the United States, but immigrants represent half of all business owners in New York and 45% of the workforce. So immigrants they earn less, they tend to have a higher poverty rate, but they are working more and they're more likely to start their own business. And so some of the federal policies that we're seeing that are so punitive to immigrants, as well as the threat of COVID-19 in the US and other factors, is really going to create a problem for the economic recovery of the city as a whole. So while the plan is intended to help address the disparities of the immigrant population in particular, it really is to drive the economic success of the city as a whole.
Yeah. Share with me a little bit about housing as healthcare. I know that's something that you mentioned, and it's thought of. Some people don't think about housing as healthcare. How do housing and healthcare pretty much go hand in hand?
Yeah, housing as healthcare has never been more true than since the pandemic. Many doctors and public health experts will tell you, if you tell me what zip code you live in, I can tell you how healthy you are. I don't need to take your blood pressure. I don't need to listen to your chest. Your zip code is the major determinant of health in this country. And that is shocking and also fixable. So you have the history of housing policy was to create enforcement mechanisms and building codes to reduce the likelihood of infectious diseases and the spread. So tenement laws, rules about light and air and sewers in housing 150 years ago. These were the housing policies, but their sole purpose was to improve the health of New Yorkers and stop the spread of disease. Over the last 100 years, we've made a lot of advancements in medicine. So we thought less about housing as a public health intervention, but still we have these environmental justice issues around lead paint, around asthma, which are deeply, deeply linked to neighborhood, to racism, to a history of redlining. So the history of housing policy and public health are so linked together. And now we're just kind of realizing that again in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah. And when we talk about the pandemic, obviously it's caused a lot of people to have to make adjustments. How things had to pivot for you in the wake of COVID-19?
Our work was typically going out into the community and talking to people face to face and hosting events and panels. So just sort of logistically, it's been difficult to do our work and find ways to get our message out. So I want to thank you, Daren, for giving us a new outlet to talk about our work. And then it also just, like with everybody, it kind of paired us back to what is the most critical, important things and made everybody really personally and professionally take a look at what our priorities are. So something like housing is healthcare, which sort of seemed like just a catchphrase 6 months ago, now it's really a life and death matter.
When we talk about living, obviously we want to have healthy living. One of those things is green living, right? And I think that when we talk about green living, in a city like New York that's densely populated, having to make adjustments to improve healthcare, having to make adjustments to improve the housing crisis that we have. Green living has always been a realistic blueprint in terms of helping people to achieve both of those goals. When we talk about green living for you, how do you see green living playing out in the future?
Sure. So there's lots of ways on a kind of individual and citywide level that we need to adapt to green living and work towards a healthier built environment. So after Sandy and after COVID, we realized that climate change isn't something that's going to happen to our grandchildren. It's something that's here now, and we really need to worry about it. A lot of the city's public housing developments, for example, are in the floodplain. So we're going to have to do some really smart thinking about the impact of climate change over the next several years. And then on a micro level within our environments, we're learning a lot about the construction materials and the damage that can do to people's respiratory systems. COVID, we're starting to think about air quality, both outside and inside, in a way that we were kind of allowed to neglect before. So some of the worst zip codes for asthma in the South Bronx and Northern Manhattan are also where a lot of the COVID high incidence was.
Yeah. And so I want to ask a little bit more about moving forward, because when we talk about moving forward, advocacy is very key, very critical. Looking at COVID-19 right now, looking at the fact that there's this moratorium on evictions, looking at the city's homeless population and how that can potentially increase by way of COVID-19, and then also turning around and saying, listen, not just the homeless situation, but unemployment, all these things that actually play a way into housing. Are we looking at possibly seeing a real spike in this housing crisis post COVID-19 here in the city from your perspective?
Absolutely. We're seeing that already. And in particular, when you see neighborhoods that have a higher incidence of street homelessness, we think that's a lot because we have homeless people who would have been willing to sleep in a homeless shelter previously, but now just don't feel safe doing that. To some of your listeners, previous to my job at CHPC, I was working for the city's housing department, meeting with community boards, talking to them about supportive housing developments throughout the city as well as throughout the Bronx. And so what I really want people to understand about the homelessness issue is how interrelated these neighborhoods are. So when there's a homeless shelter on the Upper West Side that says no more, we don't need any more homeless shelters, now we need to find another location for that homeless shelter. So now that's spilled over that impact into a variety of neighborhoods all across the city. We are calling on the mayor to rezone Soho, something that maybe your listeners wouldn't think was an issue for them. But in fact, the housing crisis and gentrification across the city happened precisely because we've limited the amount of housing that happens in core Manhattan neighborhoods such as Soho. So then people who have modest means have to go looking elsewhere for an apartment. So that starts to have a spillover effect on the rents in all sorts of other neighborhoods. So I think going forward, we're really going to have a reckoning with the public health implications and also with how the neighborhoods and the boroughs are related to one another, and get away from this idea that I only have to worry about what happens in my own neighborhood.
Yeah. How can the public be better engaged with the work that you're doing? Because I think a lot of people say, listen, yeah, I am affected by this. COVID-19 has not just impacted us on an economic front, but definitely a lot of people are definitely challenged on the housing front. How can people get connected to the work and some of the advocacy that you guys are doing?
Sure. So our website is chpcny.org. So all of our research is on there. You can follow us on social media. I've written a series of op-eds about what I think this mayor should do and what I think the next mayor should do. So we'll always be happy to push people in the right direction for their advocacy work.
Yeah, don't want to be too political, but do you feel as though right now, currently, that our current mayor is doing enough in the area of housing, or do you feel as though that we should see a dramatic shift in what goes on?
So I think we've seen a tremendous volume of affordable housing development from this administration that I think we should all be proud of as a city. What I think we're missing is a sense of community engagement around why we're doing the work that we're doing and how. So I think that there hasn't been a lot of good explanation from City Hall about why the work that they're doing is so important. And I think there are, I've been very hard on this mayor recently about his leadership post-COVID, but I think there are some things that he can do to round out the end of his administration with, some real track record of success. So as I spoke about, we'd really like him to rezone Soho. We would like him to focus the affordable housing that is being created for essential workers. So, I don't know if in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood, everybody at 7 o'clock, we all opened our windows and banged pots and pans and made a big round of applause. That was lovely. That made me feel really good, but it didn't do a lick of good for the essential workers. So we're asking for the mayor to focus the affordable housing pipeline that exists on essential workers specifically. The third thing is around basement apartment conversions and equitable code enforcement.
And when we talk about code enforcement, I know that you talked about equitable. You talked and brought up equitable code enforcement. Give us a little bit about this, because some people really are not aware about how things play out with code enforcement and the disparity that's there. We only got a couple of minutes, but I do want to get into the disparities when it comes to code enforcement.
Sure. So code enforcement is equally applied across the city. So everyone is following the same rules or supposed to follow the same rules. But the difference between equality and equity is really key here. So the way in which typically a code enforcement for an existing homeowner, for example, would come down is through a 311 call. So you'd get an anonymous complaint, usually from a neighbor, sometimes from a tenant. And what we've seen is there's a growing body of data that shows that 311 calls about code enforcement and quality of life issues are much more likely to take place in neighborhoods that are changing or neighborhoods that are on the border of different ethnic and racial groups. So that worries us, right? We need to be concerned that we're putting a lot of power in, the neighbor across the street to really rain down a lot of very onerous enforcement on somebody. The rules are the rules. Sometimes the rules are good. Sometimes we think they should be changed. But I think the way in which they're enforced, we really need to take a second look at.
That cry for justice continues to go out. Let's go before we wrap up. Tell me what's coming around the corner for you guys, and how people can just stay tuned.
Sure. So we talked about New Lens for a City of Immigrants and Housing is Healthcare. And next week, we're doing an event about a feminist housing plan. So 3 out of 4 households in NYCHA are female-headed households. 85% of the families in DHS shelters are headed by women. The women earn less, they work more, they earn less. So these are all gender equity issues that we think, again, when you act like things are gender neutral, you might be missing some real equity issues. So we're going to get a bunch of people together. Everybody's welcome. You could register for the event on our website to brainstorm about what a feminist housing plan would look like.
All right. Well, Jessica Katz, we're going to leave it there. She is the executive director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. Thank you so much for sharing with us here on the Social Justice Forum.
Thanks, Daren. Great to be here.
Glad to have you. All right, listen, you got Jessica's information as to how you can stay connected, find out more about the housing crisis. It continues to be a topic of conversation right here in New York City. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We still have more show coming up. We'll be right back right after this.